A massive review of 49 brain scans shows that COVID leaves real structural damage behind, even after people feel recovered. A team of researchers led by Lai Chen, Huan Lan, and Wenxing Liu put together a systematic review of 49 published brain imaging studies. Their goal was to build a comprehensive picture of how the coronavirus impacts the central nervous system. The research was published in the journal Cerebral Cortex. They focused on studies using magnetic resonance imaging to compare the brain scans of people who had contracted COVID with those of healthy individuals. The studies included patients at various stages, from acute infection all the way through long-term recovery. Some individual studies were small with just 10 participants, while others evaluated over 200 patients. By pooling the results, the researchers identified consistent patterns of abnormalities across several key brain regions. The frontal lobe, which handles decision-making and cognitive control, frequently showed structural changes. The researchers note that the prefrontal cortex is highly sensitive to psychosocial stress. This means the stress of the pandemic itself, alongside the biological infection, might contribute to these structural shifts. Structural changes in the frontal lobe might explain the loss of top-down cognitive control observed in some patients. One commenter on the original Reddit post put it bluntly, asking whether this helps explain the clear cognitive decline people are seeing across society after COVID. The temporal lobe includes areas like Heschel's gyrus, a region that processes auditory information. Patients recovering from COVID often experience difficulties processing sound, which can contribute to chronic fatigue as the brain works harder during daily listening activities. The temporal and parietal lobes, areas involved in sensory processing and attention, also exhibited noticeable differences in patients who had recovered from the virus. This helps explain why so many people report that everyday conversations leave them more exhausted than before. The parietal lobe, a region involved in visual and spatial attention, also showed structural changes linked to impaired attention allocation. In many of these regions, COVID patients displayed a reduction in overall grey matter volume and a thinning of the outer cortical layer. This tissue loss could result from reduced oxygen supply or severe immune system inflammation during the infection. Conversely, a few studies reported localized increases in grey matter volume. The researchers suggest this could represent temporary swelling caused by vascular injury. Or it could be the brain attempting to compensate for damaged tissue by growing new neural connections. The review highlighted extensive structural issues in the brain white matter. To measure this, scientists track the microscopic diffusion of water molecules along nerve fibers. In COVID patients, this water movement was often abnormal, indicating that the protective coating around the nerve fibers had degraded. These microscopic changes were present even in patients who experienced only mild to moderate respiratory symptoms and had otherwise normal-looking grey matter on standard medical scans. White matter contains the nerve fibers that connect the brain processing centers, so damage here means communication between different brain regions gets disrupted. Functional imaging scans revealed altered patterns of spontaneous brain activity. When patients were simply resting in the scanner, their brains showed abnormal synchronization between different regions. The limbic system, a network of deep brain structures including the insula, hippocampus, and amygdala, frequently exhibited connectivity issues. Because these areas regulate emotion and memory, functional disruptions here often correlated with clinical symptoms like anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. When patients were asked to perform working memory tasks during their scans, their brains displayed altered activation patterns, suggesting the nervous system had to reorganize its resources to maintain normal cognitive performance. Tests measuring cerebral blood flow found lower than normal circulation in several brain areas, including the frontal and temporal lobes. This restricted blood supply limits the delivery of oxygen and nutrients, which might contribute to difficulties with attention, language processing, and executive function. The review found that deep subcortical nuclei, such as the thalamus, were particularly vulnerable to this reduced blood flow. These deep relay centers have high metabolic demands and rely on adjacent blood vessels that lack secondary backup circulation. The review also looked at the olfactory network. Patients suffering from a persistent loss of smell showed disrupted connectivity in this specific network, which also correlated with lower scores on short-term verbal memory tests. One commenter pointed to an additional Lancet study finding that COVID is associated with injury to the brain dopamine system, even in healthy people who feel recovered. The reviewed studies rely heavily on cross-sectional data, meaning they capture a single snapshot of the brain after infection rather than tracking changes over an extended period. Because the vast majority of these studies lack pre-infection baseline brain scans, it is difficult to prove definitively that COVID directly caused all the observed changes. Individual biological differences present before the pandemic might account for some of the variations in brain structure and function. The researchers point out that the clinical status of the patients varied widely across the studies. Grouping together individuals with acute infections and those experiencing long-term recovery makes it challenging to isolate how the brain heals over time. Some studies also focused only on specific predefined brain regions rather than scanning the entire brain, which can artificially inflate the statistical differences. The comments on the original post reveal a pattern of personal experiences that align with what the scans are showing. One commenter described losing the ability to find common words mid-conversation, saying it feels like something that has been on a shelf as long as you have lived is suddenly gone. Another shared that they were diagnosed with ADHD a few years ago after having COVID 3 times within 2 years, and their negative symptoms went from hygiene issues to bordering on disability. Several people described taking at least 2 years to feel somewhat normal again after just a single infection, with lingering word-finding problems and flatter emotions. One couple said they both feel they got stupider post-COVID, with only partial improvement. The research is still evolving. Future studies with whole brain analyses and long-term tracking will help clarify whether these changes are permanent or reversible. For now, the MRI evidence is clear that COVID leaves a measurable mark on the brain.